welcome to Rotted Reviews, and today it's not a movie review, but rather a rant or a conversation or whatever you want to call it. But either way, I just wanted to talk with you today about extreme movies. It's honestly one of the most frequent questions that I get is, what is the most extreme movie you've ever seen, Mike? And it's not that I don't enjoy the question. I enjoy anybody that's willing to ask questions and engage with me and so forth, and I appreciate that level of engagement and that level of curiosity, especially for people that are looking for actual true blue recommendations. However, the notion of extreme movies has never really sat terribly well with me, and I kind of wanted to talk about that. Now, first of all, everybody's sensitivity levels are different, and I don't really think that that's a bad thing. I think it just makes us unique and makes us the individuals that we are. Likewise, the actual subject matter of extreme movies, for one versus another, has a lot to do with that level of sensitivity that we feel. So whereas one movie might be extreme towards one person, it might not be towards another that, doesn't really have that, that one trigger that may have been the core element focus of that film. So, I mean, it's a fairly subjective thing in the first place, just asking, generally opinion about what's the most extreme movie, but then also the nature of the films themselves can be, extremely subjective in terms of anybody's individual sensitivities and trigger points, which, I firmly believe should be respected. But more than anything, the only real time that I take actual issue with a question being asked is when it's being asked in a way that kind of gatekeeps the community. Yes, I've seen a Serbian film. Yes, I've seen the Human Centipede films. Yes, I've seen 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀 or 120 Days of Sodom, so on and so forth. I've seen a lot of the major heavy hitters out there. And, I kind of treat them on their own merits, try to see the cinematic, qualities behind them and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, it does not make me any more of a horror fan having watched those. And that's the point that I kind of want to get across, because sometimes, you know what, honestly, quite often, when the topic of extreme horror movies comes up, not necessarily when anybody asks me, but just generally when conversations get started, especially out in public forums. I know I've had this conversation in private, in Discord channels and so forth, and everybody there has been fantastic and respectful, and hats off. I love the little private communities that I'm a part of. But generally, let's just take Twitter and so on and so forth, the more public forums that anybody can hop into, or the our horror on subreddit, that kind of thing. The notion of extreme movies tends to take a very gatekeeping turn. It becomes a situation where if you haven't seen this, then you aren't a real horror fan. And there's a few problems that I have with that. First of all, you know how you know you're a real horror fan? If you like horror movies. Done. That's it. If you haven't seen 𝗘𝗨 or 120 Days of Sodom, which I would argue is not necessarily even really that much of a horror movie. It's just more of a, dramatic, extreme torture, kind of thing. But regardless, okay, let's just take, if you haven't seen Horror Hotel, yeah, you're still a horror fan if you like horror movies. If you haven't seen Nightmare on Elm Street, but you like horror movies, you're a horror fan. If you have gender blah, fill in the blank, or leave it blank, but you like horror movies, you're a horror fan. That's the only real criteria is, are you a horror fan? If you're a fan of horror. That's really it. And anything else is just gatekeeping bullshit, and I really hate seeing it. The other real issue that I take in terms of the conversations that I see about extreme horror in public communities is the notion of the one-upsmanship that kind of continues on from there. And with this category in particular, this is a very zero-sum game. Like, for instance, I have not seen any of the Slaughtered Vomit Dolls series, and I'm not going to. That's honestly one where I have a line that I just won't cross, and it honestly provides me with a little bit of, mental fortitude. It feels good to know that regardless of anything that I've seen in all my time doing this channel here, that I still do have a line. It's actually a source of comfort for me. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, if I were to watch those, then somebody would say, well, I watched this. And then you start getting into the really weird shit. And then you start getting into some of the, oddities from, 1980s Japan that, so on and so forth, that are only 23 minutes long, and you have to, struggle to find a print. And then from there, you start getting really weird. Then you start, eventually you're going to get to the point where you're paying thousands of dollars for odd prints of whatever that really doesn't have much cinematic merit, or you're going to wind up getting into territory where things are actually not being fiction anymore and getting illegal. The one-upsmanship about this just doesn't really have a ceiling, except for honestly a level of self-destruction that I can't get behind. So it's another reason that I take comfort in me having a line. And there are people out there that I guarantee you would see this video, see me saying that I have a line that I won't cross, and call me not really a horror fan because of it. But kind of stepping back just a little bit here and getting back into the individual sensibilities, because I do want to address that a little bit further here. It turns into a situation where when I'm asked what's the most extreme horror movie that I've seen, my answer kind of becomes a little bit surprising. Because here's the thing, is I could watch blood and guts and gore and so forth all day long. And honestly, the thing that'll really drive me is whether or not the characters are identifiable and the conflict is interesting and so on and so forth. It's like, it just becomes a part of the movie to me. It doesn't really affect me a whole lot. So, the extreme stuff on that level, whatever. But there are things that really do affect me greatly, and I have a lot of difficulty with them. Claustrophobia being one of them. So the Japanese movie directed by Shinya Sakamoto, Haze, really got me. It was one that I had to turn off and reapproach after taking a little bit of like a half hour, 1 hour or so on break. But showed it to a friend of mine, Sammy, and she was fine. Didn't affect her in the slightest. That was just kind of one of those big differences there. So Haze, for me, still honestly remains one of the more extreme movies that I've seen. But that's only because how it affected me on a personal level. And the same goes for non-consensual sexual assault, especially involving a minor. Things like that, I have a lot of difficulty with. And that's the kind of thing that puts it more into the extreme category for me. So, I mean, honestly, that's the level of like 120 Days of Sodom that becomes a little bit more difficult. LIE, I count as one of the more extreme movies I've seen, even though it's actually rather fairly benign film, just a dramatic film with, starring Brian Cox. But even so, the nature of the grooming of the, teenage main character was extremely hard. And I think that kind of just comes into, my past as being somebody that was approached in a sexual way when I was, quite young, probably 10 or 11, by my adult cousin. And, it became a scarring element of my life. And because of that, this became a bit of a trigger for me, and it makes it that much, not necessarily that difficult to watch these movies, but it puts it into the more extreme category for me. So if you are curious what the most extreme movie I've ever seen is, it's the 1998 movie Happiness. The film directed by Todd Solondz and starring Jon Lovitz, Philip Seymour Hoffman, and of course, Dylan Baker. I found the entire movie to be extremely uncomfortable, but the subplot involving Dylan Baker and the young boy was extremely difficult for me to watch, and then watching him engage with his son was heartbreaking and difficult. It was just overall a very challenging movie to me that took the wind right out of my sails. I don't really have a whole lot of movies that I won't rewatch. I've seen Requiem for a Dream, which a lot of people list as the one movie that they're really glad that they've seen, but they will never watch again. I don't know. I've seen it like 15 times. I love it to pieces. It's so beautiful, and difficult, I will fully admit. I'm not trying to go any kind of one-upsmanship on my level here, but Happiness is one that I don't think that I will revisit. I watched it once, and that is enough for me. And I appreciate it. I think it was actually a good movie. It was just it was my extreme movie. So yeah, I mean, in terms of people coming up to me and asking me, that question, I can give my answer, but I can't guarantee that it's going to land the same. It's not going to resonate as hard for somebody else as it did for me, so I don't know what good my answer is actually going to do. But regardless, like I said, I'm happy to have these kind of private conversations with people. But again, when we get out into the public and the general communities and so forth, trying to discuss extreme movies, it just seems like such a toxic environment of one-upsmanship and gatekeeping that it becomes just not a very fruitful conversation. It's honestly one that at this point, anytime I see the topic come up, I just walk the other way. It's not one that I want to be a part of. It's not one that I want to, engage in anybody, in the public communities with. Who knows? Maybe that'll change. Maybe some people will, add a little bit of rationality and stability to these kind of things. But, and I'm not certainly saying that, extreme movies shouldn't exist. I love that they do. I am very, very much a proponent of the arts and all the difficulties that contains. But I've never really been able to abide the conversations I see where people talk about who is and who is not a true horror fan. I've always thought that was bullshit. I hate that conversation, and I refuse to be a part of it. And honestly, the conversations about extreme horror tend to always drift there. So, that's my rant. Thank you so much for watching. I hope I haven't alienated everybody out there, but thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you on my next video. Take care, everybody. Have a good day.